saying we are protecting the one country that is not only spreading the fundamental radical version of Islam, but also financing terrorism to a great degree. Absolutely. And we are protecting, ignoring, and pretty much letting them run roughshod over the area
because they're useful.
And why are they useful?
They are useful in a very old school, sort of imperialist way. Ladies and gentlemen, Saudi Arabia is a United States colony. I know that may sound ridiculous on its face. Saudi Arabia doesn't look very American, and they certainly push a very anti-American ideology. But a U.S. colony is what Saudi Arabia is. And I'm not talking a colony in a neo-colonial, post-colonial, they've got a lot of McDonald's franchises sense. I'm talking colony in a full-throttle 19th century imperialist sense. You've heard of the British Empire, right? That empire's most important component was British India, which included modern India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Burma. They managed to control all of this territory with a tiny amount of British soldiers. They used a lot of strategies to do this, but one of the most important was client kingdoms. All of this territory was controlled by Britain, but a ton of it was controlled in the form of client kingdoms, with their own courts and even their own armies. Everybody knew they weren't really independent, but the polite fiction was carefully preserved. This allowed the inhabitants of those kingdoms to preserve some self-respect, and it kept the territory out of the hands of more powerful enemies of Great Britain. That is exactly the role that Saudi Arabia plays today. When people question why Saudi Arabia gets away with all the stuff it gets away with, the standard answers always point to Saudi power. We're told that it's the oil or all the money that the country piles back into the U.S. economy. But it's really Saudi weakness that makes them useful, not power. The country's silly ideology and infinitely corruptible ruling family makes it the perfect client kingdom. Its dozens of universities teach religion rather than nationalism or useful skills. The Saudi military barely knows how to use all the weapons it buys. Saudi Arabia has been a client kingdom for its entire modern existence. It was born because the British preferred them to the more powerful Ottomans and Persians. It has survived because the U.S. preferred it to Arab nationalists and the communists. It's a lot easier to keep a king and his family happy than it is to keep a real country happy. Saudi Arabia survived 9/11 because it successfully convinced the U.S. government that Iran presented a greater threat. That's true to a degree, but 15 years of following the Saudi path has made Iran much more powerful. It has also created ISIS and a range of other nasty organizations that carry out international terrorism in the name of Saudi ideology. Saudi Arabia is a client kingdom we no longer need. The negatives have outweighed the positives since the early 1990s. Communism hasn't been a real threat in almost 3 decades. Arab nationalism is essentially dead, and Iran would probably calm down if we just stopped invading them and their direct neighbors.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
They changed the name. And they gave a new name, a bogus name that they took out of a garbage bin, and they called it the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Why? so that you will forget the word nudged. That is why. That is the reason why they coined the new name of the place as the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And I'm talking now to the Saudi people. I pray that Allah may take my words to the Saudi people, many of whom are listening to me, many of whom have their hearts in the right place. The Saudi people, the people who live in Arabia. The reason why they changed the name and brought this new bogus name of Saudi Arabia is so that they could banish the word nudged. Well then, what is nudge? The Arabian Peninsula is divided into two main parts. On the eastern side of Arabia is the part of Arabia called Najd. And that's where you have the oil fields, that's where you have Dhahran, that's where you have Riyadh, the capital city. And on the western side of Arabia, which is bordering the Red Sea, you have the Hijaz. And in the Hijaz, you will find Makkah and Medina and Jeddah. This is how it has been from the time of the Prophet ﷺ and for centuries and centuries and centuries before that, and up to the time when these people changed the name. Why did they change the name? Why did they want the world to forget the word nudged? The answer is because when the people asked the Prophet about nudge, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he did not reply. For this one he said, Allahumma barik lana fi shamina. For this one he said, Allahumma barik lana fi yamanina. For this one he's silent. Ominous silence. Ominous silence for nudged. Why? Then when they ask a second time, O Messenger of Allah, what about our nudged? Our nudge they're talking about. If a people in Medina ask about our nudged, which nudge would they be referring to? Here we now come to the parting point between proper scholarship and bogus scholarship in Islam. Proper scholarship, authentic scholarship, honest scholarship, scholarship with integrity, scholarship with common sense in it, would know that when the people in Medina are asking about our nudge, they're asking about the nudge which is next door to Hijaz. That nudge is what they're talking about. Bogus scholarship, fraudulent scholarship, scholarship which is betraying Islam. That is a scholarship we'll look for a nudge somewhere else in Iraq or maybe in Disneyland. The time has now come with the Saudi attack on Yemen for us to expose you as bogus and fraudulent as scholars of Islam. And I pray that, oh Allah, kindly grant that these words may travel far and wide, that the world of Islam may open its eyes to be able to recognize bogus scholarship, fraudulent scholarship, those who insist that nudged, to which the people were referring when they asked the Prophet, O Messenger of Allah, what about our nudge? That the people were referring to a nudge other than the nudge next door to Hijaz in Arabia, that they were referring to a nudge somewhere in Iraq or somewhere in Disneyland. That's bogus, that's fraudulent, it's shameful. You should be ashamed of yourself for this bogus scholarship. When the Prophet answered, this is what he said, pointing to nudge. He said, from nudge there will be fitna, test and trials for the people. And that's what we now experience.
Hey there.
I think Islam hates us. There's something.
This guy is not right about Islam. But you know what? This guy isn't right either.
Our enemy is a radical network of terrorists and every government that supports them.
Neither is this guy, or this guy. Islam is at the center of so much of what we talk about in the United States today, from terrorism to geopolitics to economics to the future of Europe and the United States. I'm certainly more sympathetic to these guys than I am to these guys, but none of them are giving us the whole truth. What all of these guys are doing is providing partial narratives, because the full story doesn't serve any of their agendas. These guys are posing as truth tellers for political and economic gain, and they are winning. So far, Donald Trump's 2 attempts at a Muslim ban have failed, but the polls show that almost half of the country would like some sort of Muslim ban. The haters of Islam are winning because many people in the United States believe that they have been lied to. And they are right. The story that the establishment has been pushing about U.S. policy and terrorism simply isn't true. They're very careful to say nice things about Islam because they want to conceal some basic facts about the religion and what has been done to it over the past 50 years. There is nothing wrong with the principles of Islam. The idea that there is a very bad idea, and it's one that's worth fighting. But in order to truly fight that idea, we have to look at the whole story, not just a part of it. We need to start talking about Saudi Arabia. We need to talk about that country's cancerous relationship with the United States, and we need to talk about what that relationship has done to Islam over the past half century. We need to talk about the true roots of terrorism. These roots can be found in Saudi Arabia, and they can be found in Washington, D.C.
It describes the madness of the circles, the neoconservatives in Washington, the military-industrial complex, the Wall Street banks, and so forth. What I call the boring old patriarchs, the David Rockefellers, the George Soroses, and so, who literally think that they can use Islamic terrorism to control the world. And this project has been underway by the CIA and State Department and others since the 1950s. They have been working on this, including the Fethullah Gulen operation in Turkey that staged this recent coup attempt.
The Muslim Brotherhood was created as a co-project of certain circles in Egypt in the 1920s, Hassan al-Banna, but by British intelligence also. When Mohammed Morsi, under the operation that Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State launched, called the Arab Spring in Egypt, when Mohammed Morsi became president of the of Egypt, Muslim Brotherhood, that was a United States, a Washington-guided operation to put in an organization, a secret society, a death cult, that was guided and steered by the Central Intelligence Agency in the U.S. Department since the 1950s. The Muslim Brotherhood, and this is very, very timely right now because, as I wrote in a piece that was published on the website NEO out of Moscow a few days ago, the real Humagate scandal is the Muslim Brotherhood.
Her history and alarming connections are mostly unknown to the American people. Who is Huma Abedin? What do we know about Hillary Clinton's #1 aide and sidekick for 20 years? Hillary spoke at Huma's wedding saying, "If I had a second daughter, it would be Huma." This presidential election decides who gets to run the most powerful country on earth, so it is obviously very important to understand the facts about Huma Abedin, as she may very soon become Chief of Staff in the White House. I'll be simplifying an intricate web of people, organizations, and events that unraveled over many years. All of this information and more is available online for anyone who has access to Google. Anyway, here is an unbelievable story of infiltration unfolding before our eyes, and the most important aspect of this election that you definitely won't see on CNN. There are four main players in this: Hillary Clinton, Huma Abedin, Abdullah Omar Nassif, and Saudi Arabia. Huma was born in the USA. Then when she was 2 years old, her family moved to Saudi Arabia. They lived in Saudi Arabia for 16 years. Huma returned to the USA when she was 18 to study at George Washington University. Only after 2 years in the country, she became an intern for Hillary Clinton, and soon after started working full-time. Also in 1996, Huma was working at her family business, a journal by the Institute of Muslim Minority Affairs. The Abedin's family business is owned by the Muslim World League, Saudi Arabia's global organization that promotes violent Wahhabi Islam. They even share an office at 46 Goodge Street, London. Saliha Abedin, Huma's mother, and Hassan Abedin, Huma's brother, currently work there still. Abdullah Omar Nassif is one of the founders of the Muslim World League and served as vice president of the Saudi Kingdom Shura Council. He created Huma's family business along with her father. He also funded Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, as did Saudi Arabia for many years.
But if you read the writings of Hassan al-Banna and what he commanded his people to do, my suspicion is that it was a project of the Vatican. That's my suspicion. It's too sophisticated for a small town school teacher, Hassan al-Banna, in a remote village in Egypt, to have created this three-level structure. The important point about the Muslim Brotherhood is who picks it up. In the 30s, during the Hitler time, the Brotherhood was driven out of Egypt by the British. Apparently, if there was this connection that I alleged or referred to, at a certain point they had a falling out. Like all creations, you know, you want to do your own thing and don't want to have some British intelligence handler tell you what to do. So they went into exile, including the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. They went into exile in Berlin after 1933, 39. And that was the Berlin of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. And the Grand Mufti, who was a leading member of the Muslim Brotherhood, the spiritual leader of Jerusalem, worked with Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS. He writes in his memoirs, he told Hitler, the one condition that we have to work with you is that you allow us to kill each and every Jew in Palestine. And Hitler said to me, that's yours. The CIA locked into this in the 1950s. They discovered it in Munich, of all places, Munich, Germany, close to where I live. They found a Nazi network that was called I forget the name now, but it's in the book. But they dealt with the eastern areas, but with Muslims recruited from the territory of the Soviet Union. There are many, many nominal Muslims in the Soviet Union then. And the Nazis recruited them because they realized they have such ferocity to kill. So they were picked up by the Nazis after the end of the war. They went back to Egypt and Palestine and so forth. And when the Brotherhood attempted to assassinate Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, and failed, they were driven underground. Miles Copeland, the CIA station chief in Cairo, smuggled the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood out of Egypt into Saudi Arabia. And there began the fateful, I call it marriage made in hell, between the Muslim Brotherhood with the Wahhabi strain of Islam in Saudi Arabia. So what happened after the 50s and the 60s is that Saudi money financed the creation of the Muslim World League in Jeddah. And the Muslim World League was the evangelical, if you want to call it that, arm of the Muslim Brotherhood, going out into Pakistan, into Afghanistan, into all over the Islamic world where it was possible. And that is what precisely gave birth to the Mujahideen, the CIA project called Operation Cyclone.
To begin with, Saudi Arabia wanted to use Islamism in its fight against any external threat that may have an internal impact. I'll give you one example. In the 1950s and 60s, Saudi Arabia saw the threat to its regime coming from the leftist movement in the Arab world and also from Arab nationalism. And it used Islamism as a counterforce to actually destroy these two movements. And therefore, it sponsored Islamic education, it sponsored Islamic opinions that depict these movements as atheism. And also, during the Cold War, it enlisted its ideology on behalf of the West in order to fight battles elsewhere, such as, for example, in Afghanistan. And therefore, the Saudi Wahhabi dimension of all this Al-Qaeda is extremely important, although the Saudi regime tries to distance itself from this kind of radicalism.
I think it's important, too, that the Americans were fully in on this. There's a fairly well-known quote from Eisenhower where he says, we will use the Saudis' role in defending Mecca to help promote them as the defenders of Islam throughout the Muslim world, where he says we will use the Saudis' role in defending Mecca to help promote them as the defenders of Islam throughout the Muslim world, and they'll help us fight Nasserism and nationalism and socialism. I may not be quoting it exactly, but I'm pretty close.
Yes, absolutely. This was part of the Cold War strategy, and Saudi Arabia deployed its ideology and support and also funds in order to fight wars elsewhere. But the problem for Saudi Arabia is when this ideology came back to haunt the country itself. And it is almost like having a battle with your own ideology. And therefore, it's very difficult for the Saudis to get rid of this kind of menace. And they haven't learned lessons from 9/11. So if you look at what is going on in Syria now, in Syria, they have the Saudis have created armed rebels who are actually almost working on behalf of the Saudis in Syria. So that the Syrian revolution was derailed and lost its democratic slogans, and now it became a sectarian war between different groups, the Shia and the Sunnis. And with Saudi intervention, we find that the rebels who were promoted were called the Islamic Front. And we have seen how this was unfolding in Syria. Until recently, Saudi Arabia allowed its own young men to travel to Syria, or if it didn't allow them, it kept a blind eye. And only recently, just a week before Obama's visit, Saudi Arabia introduced this new anti-terrorism law, which says that anybody who goes to Syria and come back will face 20 years in prison. And the interesting thing is, yes, we may keep a blind eye on those people going, but we're going to arrest them when they come back. But there was no effort that was obvious to me that they will make sure they do not go there to fight.
Well, it may be that they're going to make them stay there and fight with a law like that.
I think the best thing that Saudi regime can hope for is for them to go and die there.
That's sort of what I was saying. There seems to have been a change from the days when the Saudis seemed to be very concerned about attacks on their regime in Saudi Arabia from Al-Qaeda forces. There seems to have been a kind of accommodation in some way that now, in fact, it seems that the Al-Qaeda type forces are almost like part of the way the Saudis wage asymmetrical warfare and use them in leverage. I mean, the most obvious place is in Syria, but you see it in Iraq. But then you see these threats. I talked about 9/11, but we know about Bandar's threat, Prince Bandar's threat to Tony Blair when there was an inquiry into the bribery scandal. based on Saudis buying several $1 billion of weapons, and apparently Bandar got a $1 billion bribe, and Bandar says to Blair, you better stop this inquiry or I can't promise there won't be another 7/7 when the buses blew up in London. And more recently, apparently Bandar threatened Putin and said, we control the Chechen terrorists. It seems like it's a lever of power in their hands.
Yes, absolutely. And we have seen since 2008, there were no terrorist attacks in Saudi Arabia. They managed to push the Al-Qaeda to Yemen, basically. They haven't destroyed it. They haven't removed it. They simply had forced it to migrate to Yemen, and a lot of Saudis have left Saudi Arabia to go there. But the interesting thing is it has been used as a sort of a pressure on foreign governments, meaning that you do as we want you to do, or we will not cooperate with you in terms of intelligence cooperation, or we would actually they wouldn't put it so directly, but it is a subtle hint that when the Serious Fraud Office in Britain wanted to open up the Al Yamama weapons deal and the corruption that was involved with BAE system, the Saudis immediately announced that if this serious fraud investigation goes ahead, they will cease to cooperate with Britain on intelligence, meaning that we will not be able to help you catch the terrorist, basically. And it is interesting that they may have had quite a close relationship. They know them so well that they hold information about them that they're only going to release to those other intelligence services that cooperate with the Saudis, and also in governments that are supposedly friendly governments.
The special relationship was especially useful in the CIA effort to take down secular regimes, beginning with Nasser in Egypt. They offered financial backing and sanctuary to the Muslim Brotherhood, a documented CIA and British intelligence asset. The Saudis exploited the special relationship to export its Wahhabi brand of Islam. Between 1975 and 2003, the Saudi government spent over $70 billion building mosques and religious schools around the world. Private Saudi citizens spent billions more on Wahhabi projects. Charities such as the Muslim World League and its affiliate, the International Islamic Relief Organization, were headed up by Saudi government officials and closely tied to the government. Propaganda and indoctrination by the Wahhabi sect against infidels and branding other Muslims as apostates and an emphasis on jihad has led to radicalization and terrorism. Terror groups the U.S. says it's fighting against are directly influenced by Wahhabism. These include Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, Al-Nusra, and dozens of other groups.
والحق أن مصطلح الإرهاب هو مصطلح محمود ومصطلح مطلوب شرعا، وقد تتعجبوا كلمة الإرهاب هي مصطلح يريدها الله سبحانه وتعالى ويريدها الرسول صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم، لقول الله تعالى: وأعدوا لهم ما استطعتم من قوة ومن رباط الخيل ترهبون به عدو الله وعدوكم.
A diplomatic cable authored by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, released by WikiLeaks in 2010, reveals the U.S. knew the Saudis are behind the support and financing of international terrorism.
There's an early 2014 email from Hillary Clinton, so not so long after she left Secretary of State, to her campaign manager, John Podesta. That email, it states that ISIS, is funded by Saudi Arabia and Qatar, the governments of Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Now, this is I think this is the most significant email in the whole collection. And perhaps because Saudi and Qatari money is spread all over the place, including into many media institutions. All serious analysts know, even the US government has mentioned or agreed with, that some Saudi figures have been supporting ISIS, funding ISIS.
Clinton said it's an ongoing challenge to persuade Saudi officials to treat terrorist financing emanating from Saudi Arabia as a strategic priority. During the election, Clinton demanded the Gulf Emirates stop funding terrorism.
For starters, it is long past time for the Saudis, the Qataris, and the Kuwaitis and others to stop their citizens from funding extremist organizations. And they should stop supporting radical schools and mosques around the world that have set too many young people on a path toward extremism.
Left unmentioned is the fact the Clinton Foundation took money from the very states she accused of funding terror. Saudi Arabia gave between $10 million and $25 million to the foundation. At least $1 million more was donated by Friends of Saudi Arabia, which was co-founded by a Saudi prince. She also oversaw the sale of weapons to the Saudis while at the State Department.
One quick search through the Clinton Foundation's website and you'll find yourself a long list of donors, ranging from the average Joe donating just $250 or less, all the way north of $25 million and everywhere in between. But look a little closer and you'll see donations from governments and heads of state from authoritarian regime nations with long-standing human rights abuses. Countries like Saudi Arabia, who donated between $500,000 to $1 million to the Clinton Foundation just weeks before she was sworn in, found themselves with huge arms deals with the Clinton State Department. The Saudis were able to purchase advanced fighter jets from Boeing, a deal worth nearly $30 billion. The Gulf nation donated nearly $10 million to the foundation, leading up to Clinton taking the job as Secretary of State. Other nations include Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, Qatar, and Algeria, just to name a few.
Clinton didn't mention the fact the CIA is largely responsible for the growth of Salafist terror groups, most notably in Afghanistan, when the U.S. worked covertly to expel the Soviets in the 1980s. Both the Afghan Arabs, later Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban were created from the ranks of the Mujahideen, financed by Saudi Arabia and the CIA. It's estimated the CIA spent around $3 billion on the covert war in Afghanistan. In total, the Saudis and its partners in the Gulf would spend around $40 billion on the effort. It was later discovered much, if not most, of the money was skimmed off and held at the notoriously corrupt BCCI bank.
One of the most closely guarded secrets of the Cold War was America's role in supporting Afghan warlords known as the Mujahideen. The official story is that America backed these fundamentalists in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979. But that's not true. It was 6 months before the Soviet invasion, in July of that year, that President Jimmy Carter authorized $500 million to help set up the Mujahideen, a terrorist organization. The American people were completely unaware that their government, together with the British Secret Service, MI6, had begun training and funding Islamic extremists, including Osama bin Laden. Out of this came the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and September the 11th.
President Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, was largely responsible for organizing the covert war. He went to Pakistan in 1979 to urge on the Mujahideen to launch a decade-long war.
U.S. National Security Advisor Brzezinski flew to Pakistan to set about rallying resistance. He wanted to arm the Mujahideen without revealing America's role. On the Afghan border near the Khyber Pass, he urged the soldiers of God to redouble their efforts.
We know of their deep belief in God, and we are confident that their struggle will succeed. You know, that land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
In December, it was reported Saudi Arabia is still funding the Taliban, despite insisting otherwise. In the 1990s, the Saudis and Pakistanis made secret deals with the Taliban and Osama bin Laden. The CIA and Pakistan's ISI gave the Taliban access to tens of thousands of weapons left over from the Soviet-Afghan War to supply tens of thousands of soldiers. In 1997, the Saudis, Pakistan, and the United Arab Emirates officially recognized the Taliban government. The Saudis would later obstruct an effort by the U.S. to investigate bin Laden and his activities in Afghanistan prior to the attacks of September 11, 2001. They also protected bin Laden and didn't interfere with al-Qaeda's effort to raise money, recruit and train operatives, and establish cells throughout the kingdom. In 1996, during a meeting monitored by French intelligence, the Saudis said they planned to reward bin Laden for his efforts to spread Wahhabism in Chechnya, Kashmir, Bosnia, and other places. In 2015, Zacharias Moussaoui, the so-called 20th 9/11 hijacker, claimed that members of the Saudi royal family had supported al-Qaeda. As part of a civil case that was brought against the Saudis by the 9/11 families, Moussaoui went so far as to name specific members of the Saudi royal family who had donated money to the terrorist group. Evidence the Saudis fund the Islamic State surfaced in 2016, when WikiLeaks released an email between John Podesta and Hillary Clinton. In the August 2014 email, Clinton said diplomatic pressure should be brought down on the Qataris and Saudis to stop them from assisting the Islamic State. The United States has also been accused of supplying the terror army. In 2015, a report issued by Amnesty International found that most of the Islamic State's weapons came from the United States. While the NGO says the equipment was looted and taken from Iraqi military forces, other reports say military supplies were airdropped to ISIS. The jihadi group posted a video online showing a cache of weapons.
معدات عسكرية معدات إضافية هذه بعض الأسلحة العسكرية التي ألقتها القوات الأمريكية للأحزاب اليابجية واليابكية.
The Pentagon said the airdrop bundle had inadvertently drifted into ISIS territory. Evidence Saudi Arabia has bankrolled, indoctrinated, trained, and lavishly funded terror groups for decades has fallen on deaf ears. The special relationship has never really been seriously challenged or endangered. When Obama said he planned to sell billions of dollars worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia, few in Congress complained. The Saudis need the weapons to replenish their arsenal, used up bombing neighboring Yemen into the Stone Age, an illegal war enabled by the United States. Trump considers Yemen an important battleground in its war against Iran. At the start of his administration, he authorized a commando raid on a village in Yemen that killed civilians, including 9 children under the age of 13. For the establishment, it's important to maintain the special relationship, which is basically a marriage of murder and terror. Israel and Saudi Arabia will remain the preferred clients in the Middle East.